Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in the waiting room of General Hospital was thick with a sterile, antiseptic chill, a stark contrast to the feverish anxiety that pulsed through its occupants. It was a space designed for quiet despair, for the hushed conversations and silent prayers that accompanied life's most fragile moments. But on this particular afternoon, it felt more like the tense, silent green room before a theatrical performance that would shatter every life connected to it. At the center of this gathering was the distinguished, silver-haired figure of Edward Quatermain, propped up in a specialized wheelchair, his face a mask of imperious impatience. Beside him, his wife, Lila, her gentle hands folded in her lap, emanated a calm that seemed to be the room's only anchor to sanity. Their son, Alan, paced near the large window overlooking the hospital's main entrance, his white doctor's coat a symbol of a control he did not feel. His wife, Monica, sat rigidly on a vinyl chair, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her mind undoubtedly calculating the various financial and emotional ramifications of the situation. And then there was the object of their collective, fraught attention, Ronnie. He sat slightly apart from the family cluster, in a hard plastic chair that seemed to swallow his slender frame. He was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a paper cup of water that had long gone warm. A bandage was wrapped around his head, a testament to the recent, chaotic car accident that had precipitated this gathering. The doctors had insisted on a period of observation, and the family had insisted on staying. They were worried, of course. He was, after all, the long-lost son, the heir returned, the miracle that had descended upon the Quatermain mansion just a few short months ago, mending a hole in their family tapestry that had been torn open for decades. The doctors said it's just a minor concussion, but they must be thorough, Alan said, breaking the silence for what felt like the 100th time. Standard procedure with head injuries. Standard procedure, Edward grumbled, thumping his fist on the arm of his wheelchair. I'll give them standard procedure. Keeping us all cooped up here when the boy clearly needs to be in his own bed. The Quatermain bed. Not this institutional cot. Now, Edward, let the doctors do their job, Lila soothed, her voice like a warm blanket. Ronnie needs their care right now. We must be patient. Ronnie flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound of his name. His name. That was the core of the churning, nauseating vortex in his stomach. Every time one of them said it with such familial fondness, such unearned affection, it felt like a hot brand searing his conscience. He looked at their faces, the stern concern of Edward, the gentle worry of Lila, the professional anxiety of Alan, the guarded care of Monica. They were good people, in their own complicated, wealthy, and often ruthless way. They had taken him in. They had given him a name, a history, a future. And he had swindled them. The word echoed in his mind, amplified by the pounding in his skull. Swindler. Con artist. Fraud. He had worn many names in his 35 years, but Ronnie Quatermain had been his most audacious performance yet. It had started as a desperate gamble, a long-shot play based on an old rumor he'd overheard in a dank bar from a drunken old man who'd once worked on the Quatermain estate. A story about a baby, a secret adoption, a cover-up. He had researched, crafted a backstory, and inserted himself into their lives with the precision of a surgeon. He had expected suspicion, tests, a brutal grilling. What he had not expected was their immediate, desperate, overwhelming need to believe. They had wanted him to be Ronnie. They had needed him to be the son stolen from them by tragedy and circumstance. And he, a man who had never known a family, who had been forged in the cold fires of foster care and petty crime, had found himself seduced by the very fantasy he was selling. The accident had changed everything. The squeal of tires, the shattering of glass, the violent lurch, in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, suspended between life and death, the carefully constructed edifice of his lies had cracked. The face that had flashed before his eyes wasn't that of a fictional childhood, it was the harsh, lined face of his last partner in crime, Mickey, telling him to cut the sentimental crap and remember the score. The life he was about to lose wasn't Ronnie Quatermain's life of privilege, it was the hollow, nomadic existence of a man named Joe Nobody. As he sat in that waiting room, the beeping of the monitors down the hall sounding like a countdown to his own execution, he knew he couldn't do it anymore. The weight of the deception was physically crushing him. The concussion had rattled his brain, but it had also shaken something loose inside him, a vestige of the person he might have been, had his life taken a different path. A person with a shred of decency. A young nurse with a kind smile entered. "Mr. Quartermain? The doctor has cleared you. You're free to go home. Just take it easy for a few days, and follow up if you have any dizziness or nausea." "Thank you, my dear," Lila said, standing and moving towards Ronnie, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "There, you see? Everything is fine. Let's get you home." Ronnie looked up at her, at the genuine relief and affection in her eyes, and his stomach twisted into a tighter knot. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He merely nodded, a stiff, jerky motion. The journey back to the Quartermain mansion was a silent, surreal procession in the plush interior of the family's town car. Edward continued to mutter about hospital incompetence, Alan made small talk about hospital policy, and Lila held Ronnie's hand, her touch a burning brand of kindness. He stared out the window at the passing streets of Port Charles, a town he had come to as a predator and now felt like a prisoner in. The grand iron gates of the estate swung open, and the car crunched up the long, winding driveway, the imposing manor looming like a gilded cage. Once inside, the familiar opulence felt alien and accusatory. The portraits of stern Quartermain ancestors seemed to glare down at him from the walls, their painted eyes seeing right through his facade. The crystal chandeliers refracted the light into 1,000 tiny daggers. "I think we could all use a drink," Alan announced, moving towards the well-stocked bar in the drawing room. "Brandy for you, Father? Mother? Ronnie?" "Please," Ronnie managed to croak, his throat dry. They settled into the plush, expensive furniture, Edward in his favorite wingback chair, Lila on the sofa, Alan and Monica in adjacent chairs. Ronnie remained standing, hovering near the fireplace, the weight of the moment pressing down on him so heavily he felt his knees might buckle. Monica took a sip of her sherry, her gaze analytical. "You've been very quiet, Ronnie. The accident must have been more of a shock than the doctors realized." It was," he said, his voice low and strained. "Nonsense," Edward boomed, taking a hearty swallow of brandy. "The boy is tough. A Quartermain through and through. A little fender bender isn't going to keep him down." He raised his glass. "To your swift recovery, my boy." Ronnie watched as Alan, Monica, and Lila raised their glasses. The simple, familial gesture was the final straw. It was so normal, so accepting, and it was built on a foundation of quicksand. He couldn't let them drink to a lie. He couldn't swallow another moment of this charade. "Stop." The word was quiet, but it cut through the room's atmosphere with the force of a gunshot. 4 pairs of eyes turned to him, glasses frozen in midair, expressions shifting from relaxed contentment to confused alarm. "Ronnie?" Lila asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, darling?" He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air catching in his lungs like shards of glass. He looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces one last time before he shattered the illusion he had so carefully built. "My name," he began, his voice gaining a fragile, desperate strength, "is not Ronnie Quartermain." A beat of profound, utter silence. It was as if all the sound in the world had been sucked out of the room. Edward's face, initially confused, began to darken with impatience. "What are you talking about? The concussion has you confused." "Alan, the boy is delirious." Alan stood up, his doctor's instincts taking over. "Ronnie, you've had a traumatic experience. You're not thinking clearly. Let me give you something to help you rest." "No!" Ronnie's voice was sharper now, laced with a frantic energy. He took a step back, holding up his hands as if to ward them off. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. Please. You have to listen to me. You have to hear this." Monica's eyes had narrowed, her sharp intellect instantly switching from familial concern to cold assessment. She said nothing, but she lowered her glass, placing it carefully on the table beside her, her body coiled and ready. "I am not your son," Ronnie continued, his gaze locking with Lila's. The pain in her eyes was already beginning to form, a deep, gathering storm of heartbreak, and it nearly broke his resolve. But he had to continue. He had to lance this festering wound. I'm not the baby that was taken from you. I never was. This is preposterous. Edward slammed his glass down, brandy sloshing over the side onto the polished mahogany table. We have the DNA tests. The proof. The proof was faked, Ronnie said, the confession feeling like a physical expulsion of poison. The private investigator you hired, the one who found me? He was a conman, an associate of mine named Mickey. He substituted the samples. The real Ronnie Quartermain. I don't know who he is or where he is. Or if he's even alive. I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. The room was a tableau of suspended animation. Alan slowly sank back into his chair, his face ashen, his professional composure completely obliterated. Monica's lips were pressed into a thin, white line, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Edward was apoplectic, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But it was Lila who shattered the silence. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips, a whimper of pure, unadulterated agony. She brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes, wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrific understanding, filled with tears. No, she whispered, the word a fragile plea. No, that's not possible. I felt it. In my heart, I knew it was you. A mother knows. Her words were the sharpest knife of all. Ronnie felt his own eyes sting with tears he had no right to shed. You have every right to hate me, he said, his voice cracking. You have every right to throw me out and call the police. But you have to know, what started as a con, it became something else. Living here, with you, you gave me a family. You gave me a name. You showed me a kindness I have never, ever known in my entire life. He began to pace, the words tumbling out of him now in a torrent, a desperate need to make them understand the entirety of the deception, to purge himself completely. My real name is Joe Rizzo. I grew up in the system. Foster homes, juvenile detention. I learned how to read people, how to tell them what they wanted to hear. It was a survival skill. I met Mickey a few years ago. We ran small cons, credit card scams, fake inheritances. Then he heard the old Quartermain story from a washed-up former employee in a bar. It was the big score. The ultimate long con. He stopped and faced them, his arms spread in a gesture of surrender and self-flagellation. I studied you. I learned everything I could about the family, about the timeline of the kidnapping, about your personalities. I knew which buttons to push. I knew Edward would respond to ambition, Alan to a shared interest in medicine, Monica to cleverness. And Lila, his voice broke again as he looked at her. I knew you just needed someone to love. Someone to come home. He detailed the mechanics of the swindle with a clinical, brutal honesty. The forged documents, the staged chance meeting with the corrupt PI, the coaching sessions with Mickey on how to act, what to say, which childhood memories to remember after a suitable period of trauma-induced amnesia. He explained how he had subtly reinforced their belief, how he had played on their hopes and their grief. I was going to wait a few more months, he confessed, his voice dropping to a haunted whisper. Wait for the trust to be absolute, then gain access to the major accounts, the holding companies. I was going to siphon off a few million and disappear. That was the plan. Just another score. He looked around the room, at the shattered faces of the people he had come to care for in his own twisted, broken way. But the plan changed, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Because you weren't the marks I thought you'd be. You were a family. A real, complicated, messy, but loving family. Edward, you taught me about business, but you also asked about my day. Alan, you talked to me about being a doctor, about the oath you took. Monica, you challenged me, you made me think sharper. And Lila, you loved me. Unconditionally. You saw a son in me, and for the first time in my miserable life, I felt what it was like to have a mother. He swiped at the tears now streaming freely down his face, making no attempt to hide them. The accident, when I thought I was going to die, I realized I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of dying as a fraud. I was afraid that the last thing I would ever be was a lie to the only people who had ever shown me real kindness. I couldn't carry it anymore. The weight of it was killing me from the inside out. He finally stopped, his energy spent. He stood there, in the center of the grand Quartermain drawing room, a exposed, broken man, waiting for the axe to fall. The silence that followed was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a universe collapsing, of a future being erased. Edward was the first to move. He didn't speak. Instead, he let out a guttural, raw roar of pure fury. He grabbed his brandy glass and hurled it into the fireplace, where it exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. You viper, he snarled, his body trembling with rage. You filthy, lying swindler. In my home. Eating my food. We took you in. We gave you our name. He struggled to rise from his chair, his face contorted in a mask of hatred. I'll have you destroyed. I'll ruin you. I'll see you in prison for the rest of your miserable life. Alan finally found his voice, though it was hollow and disbelieving. All of it? The DNA, it was all a lie. My God. The tests were run through a reputable lab. How could you? The depth of this deception, he looked physically ill, as if the very foundations of his scientific, evidence-based world had been vaporized. Monica stood up slowly, her movements precise and controlled, a predator assessing its prey. The warmth she had occasionally shown was gone, replaced by an arctic coldness. So, the memory of the red tricycle in the garden? The story about the lullaby Lila used to sing? All of it was research. You're not just a thief. You're a psychological vampire. You fed on our grief. Her voice was quiet, but every word was a precisely aimed dart, laced with venom. You manipulated a mother's love. There is a special place in hell for people like you. But it was Lila's reaction that was the most devastating. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She simply sat on the sofa, the tears streaming down her face in silent rivers. She wasn't looking at Joe Rizzo, the con man. She was staring at the empty space where her son had been, her body seeming to fold in on itself, diminished by a grief that was fresh and yet achingly familiar. It was the second time she had lost her son. This time, the loss was compounded by the brutal knowledge that the first had been a cruel, calculated fiction. Mother? Alan said, his anger momentarily eclipsed by concern for her. Lila slowly raised her head, her eyes, pools of infinite sorrow, finally meeting Joe's. Why? She asked, her voice a thread of sound. Why would you do such a cruel thing? Joe swallowed hard, the guilt of physical weight in his chest. At first, it was for the money. It was always for the money. But then, it was for you. For this. He gestured weakly around the room. I was nobody. I was invisible. And then, for a little while, I was somebody. I was Ronnie Quartermain. I had a history. I had a family that wanted me. I got addicted to it. I knew it was wrong, I knew it was a house of cards, but I couldn't make myself walk away. I'm so sorry. I know that means nothing, but it's the only truth I have left to give you. The sound of the police siren, faint at first then growing rapidly louder, cut through the heavy atmosphere of the room. It had been Monica, with her phone discreetly in her lap, who had sent the silent text to the Port Charles PD the moment the confession had begun. Joe didn't flinch. He almost welcomed it. This was the justice he deserved, the concrete, tangible consequence of his actions. It was cleaner than the emotional devastation he had wrought in this room. Edward pointed a trembling finger at him. That's for you. You're finished. Do you hear me? Finished. Two uniformed officers entered the drawing room, their presence a jarring intrusion of the real world into the gothic tragedy that had just unfolded. Alan, his voice tight with a mixture of rage and duty, explained the situation in clipped, clinical terms. This man is an imposter. He has just confessed to fraud, identity theft, and God knows what else. He is not a member of this family. As the officers approached him, no, he was Joe Rizzo again, Ronnie was dead, looked one last time at the Quartermaines. Edward, furious and vindictive. Alan, betrayed and disgusted. Monica, cold and triumphant. And Lila, utterly and completely broken. I'm sorry, he whispered again, knowing the words were worthless. One of the officers took his arm, reading him his rights. The words "you have the right to remain silent" echoed ironically in his ears. He had been silent for too long. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had destroyed the beautiful, terrible lie they had all been living. As he was led from the room, he didn't struggle. He walked with his head down, the swindler exposed, the illusion shattered. The grand front door of the Quartermaine mansion closed behind him with a heavy, final thud that resonated through the silent, stunned house. Inside, the aftermath began to settle like a toxic dust. Edward was already on the phone with the family lawyer, his voice booming with instructions to ensure Joe Rizzo never saw the light of day again. Alan was pouring himself a very large, very straight scotch, his hands shaking so badly the bottle clanked against the glass. Monica stood by the window, watching the police car pull away, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. Was it satisfaction, or was it the faintest hint of pity for the sheer, audacious tragedy of it all? But Lila remained on the sofa, motionless. She picked up the brandy glass that Edward had thrown, not the shattered one from the fireplace, but the one she herself had been about to drink from in a toast to her son. She stared into its empty depths, as if looking for a reflection that was no longer there. The truth had been confessed, the swindler had been revealed, but the cost of that revelation was immeasurable. A stolen son had been stolen from them a second time, and the hole in the Quartermaine family had been torn open once more, this time raw, bleeding, and laced with the bitter poison of a betrayal that would haunt them for the rest of their days. The stunning revelation was over, but the shockwaves were only just beginning to spread, destined to ripple through their lives, their relationships, and the very foundation of their world for a long, long time to come. Ronnie sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling as the faint hum of the overhead light filled the silence. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, as he stared down at the metal table. Across from him, Dante stood, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but eyes sharp with suspicion. "You've got one last chance, Ronnie," Dante said, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "You better start talking, because right now, it's not looking good for you." Ronnie swallowed hard, sweat glistening on his temple. "You think I wanted this?" he said, his voice cracking. "You think I planned for it to go this far?" Dante leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "You lied to everyone, man. You made fools out of people who trusted you, especially Sam and Spinelli. You better tell me what the hell you were thinking." Ronnie's shoulders sagged as he let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he murmured. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Outside the room, Sam stood watching through the two-way glass, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "He's lying," she muttered. "He's always lying. Ronnie's not sorry, he's just sorry he got caught." Spinelli hovered beside her, his face pale and eyes wide behind his glasses. "Stone Cold was right," he whispered. "The deception runs far deeper than any of us anticipated." Sam turned sharply toward him, frustration bubbling up. "Deeper?" "Spinelli, the guy conned half of Port Charles. He made us think he was helping us, that he was one of the good guys." Her voice shook as anger overtook the confusion. "All the while, he was playing us. He used every single one of us to cover his tracks." Inside, Dante slammed his hand against the table, making Ronnie flinch. "You had people believing in you, Ronnie. You said you wanted to clean up the streets, that you were done with the lies. What was the real plan? Who were you working for?" Ronnie lifted his gaze, his eyes rimmed with guilt. "It started out small," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Just a few favors, a few shortcuts. I was broke, Dante. The bills were piling up, and someone came along with an offer I couldn't refuse." Dante's expression hardened. "Let me guess, someone with deep pockets and no conscience." Ronnie nodded slowly. "They said no one would get hurt. I just had to look the other way once in a while. But then it snowballed. One favor turned into 10. Before I knew it, I was in too deep. Dante's disbelief turned to disgust. So you sold out. You sold out your badge, your friends, this whole department, for what? Money? Ronnie's lips trembled as he spoke. It wasn't just money. They threatened me, Dante. They said they'd go after my sister if I didn't do what they wanted. Dante stepped back, shaking his head. You could have come to me. You could have come to any of us. But instead, you kept lying. You let innocent people take the fall. Ronnie's eyes filled with tears. I know. And I'll never forgive myself for that. In the observation room, Sam's anger wavered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of pity. He's saying he was threatened, she said quietly. Spinelli frowned, tilting his head. The criminal underworld often manipulates through fear, fair Samantha. Yet I find it difficult to reconcile this tale of coercion with Ronnie's prior arrogance. Sam sighed. Yeah. He never seemed scared. He seemed smug. She folded her arms again, her voice trembling with exhaustion. I can't even tell what's real anymore. Back inside, Dante leaned closer. You're gonna tell me everything, Ronnie. Names, locations, every deal you made, every lie you told. No more half-truths. Ronnie nodded weakly. There was one person pulling the strings. You know them too. Dante's brow furrowed. Who? Ronnie hesitated, the silence dragging out until it felt unbearable. It's someone from the inside, he finally whispered. Someone high up. Dante's pulse quickened. You better not be playing me right now. Ronnie shook his head, his voice trembling. I wish I was. But the person who set this all up, who made me do those things, it was someone you trust. Across the hallway, Anna Devane entered, her face serious as ever. What's he saying? She asked Sam, her tone clipped. Sam turned to her, eyes flashing. He's saying someone else was behind it, someone high up. Anna's jaw clenched. Of course he is. That's what they all say when they're cornered. But even as she spoke, something in her eyes betrayed uncertainty. She knew the department had cracks that someone clever could exploit. Back in the interrogation room, Ronnie finally said the name, and Dante's blood ran cold. No, Dante muttered, shaking his head. That's not possible. Ronnie met his gaze with haunted eyes. It's true. They were the one feeding me orders. Every move I made, every lie I told, it came from them. Dante felt his stomach twist. You realize what you're saying? You're accusing one of the highest-ranking people in this town. Ronnie nodded. I know. But it's the truth. Outside, Anna's earpiece crackled with Dante's voice relaying what Ronnie said. Her face froze, her breath catching. That can't be, she whispered, almost to herself. Not them. Sam watched her reaction carefully. You look like you believe him, Sam said quietly. Anna straightened her shoulders. Believing and proving are two different things, she replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Hours later, news of Ronnie's confession rippled through Port Charles like wildfire. At the Metro Court, Carly sat at the bar scrolling through her phone. You're kidding me, she said, looking up at Olivia. Ronnie? That slimeball cop who used to hang around Dante? Olivia nodded grimly. Yeah. Apparently he just confessed to a whole string of crimes. Said he was part of some bigger operation. Carly scoffed. I knew he was bad news from day one. You could see it in his eyes. Always thought he was slicker than everyone else. At the same time, over at General Hospital, Liz overheard part of the gossip while checking patient charts. Ronnie? She repeated, stunned. I thought he left town months ago. Epiphany shook her head. Looks like he was here all along, stirring up trouble under everyone's noses. Liz frowned. And now he's confessing? What's the catch? In the PCPD locker room, Dante sat alone, his head in his hands. The